entrepreneurship because a lot of their effort in recent years has been promoting a better society in other parts of the world than the initial focus was on, say, Europe, North America. And it's actually most of the people who would be attending the conferences, whether they're in China, there's an India conference, there's one in Indonesia in June, there's Davos in January, there's like about 8 of these conferences. It really is the whole world that's there. It's been quite interesting to observe the shifts, even over a 5-year period that I've been going to the conferences fairly frequently. Middle East has come a long way in terms of having a strong presence there. Russia, certainly some of the Russian people are coming along very strongly. 4 years ago they started up what they call Davos East, or Davos Summer, which is in China. And that's fascinating to observe. 60% of the 1,200 people are Chinese at that conference, but the sheer collection of the other people, you get a great melting pot on that. So they're interested in what does entrepreneur look like in non-Silicon Valley type environments, and that was part of what the motivation of this project was. It morphed, it started off as a relative constrained academic study of what were the role of management systems in terms of the growth of companies. I had done a fairly extensive study on that in Silicon Valley, and I said, well, can I do that globally? Well, that turned out to be a 400-page report, about 8 pages. And so it sort of kept on expanding in scope and diversity, but basically, I mean, you've got a copy there. That's the short version of the report. There's a longer version that will be online on that, because they thought that your eyeballs start to get a bit tired after 240 pages or whatever it is. So what I'll do is I'll go through and talk about some of the key elements. And what we're doing in this report is focusing at the company level as well as at the sector level. And understanding the sector is a very important backdrop to sort of thinking about the strategies and the managerial styles that you want to see going on here. But the first 2 sections of the report are really an attempt to build a framework to think about what new ventures and what are the opportunities and the risks of those. So, because every time I would see a new venture, whether it was the Irish companies coming at me, boards that I'd been on, case studies that I'd written or worked with companies, they sort of had variants. They weren't all sort of copycats of each other. And after a while, I started to try and force some structure into, well, what makes this group different from that? How do the opportunities and risks of they differ? And so the first 2 sections of this report are a fairly concise attempt to get hold of these differences. And I'll go through that with some illustrations. And part of what we were doing is the most extensive part of the report in pages is there's 70 executive cases, and these cases are on from about 22 countries, and they are about 8 standard questions where we ask them what was the source of the idea, what were the growth accelerators from the business, what were the growth challenges, what were the lessons from entrepreneurship that you had, and most of the focus was on the CEOs and founders of the companies responding to that. And the combination, I think, of Stanford University, we've got some really class colleagues in China on this project, and Europe, and the World Economic Forum. We could pretty much get to people we wanted to get to. We didn't, and there were some companies that, frankly, were not going to participate in the project. Facebook certainly was not going to participate when we have questions, what was the source of the idea? And how did that evolve? That was probably not going to be a good starting question to have continuing dialogue with that company on that. But I think in general, it was wonderful, the reception that we've got to when we made attempts to do this. So I'll just talk a little bit about the framework. And I've broken it up into 9 different categories of these type businesses. And then I'll talk about the risks and opportunities. And so the first one, I'll describe these in a little bit more detail in a minute, but there's these vary dramatically, and they vary by industry and they vary by country. And I'll explain them as we go through. The other aspect of it is that we have what we call the opportunities and the risks. So if we take a single venture, one of the challenges is how big is the market that you're dealing with? Okay, that's a fundamental question that arises. And we'll see how different strategies address that question right from the start, or have a difficulty addressing that. The second one is, can you create value? It's not just enough to sort of have somebody use it, but are they prepared to pay for it somewhere? Doesn't have to be instantaneously, because we have a lot of ventures now that have very thin revenue bases, but clearly their market valuations are quite sizable on that. Importantly is, how do you capture the value? That is, if you create the value, can you put in place a business model where you're part of the person capturing that value? And we see a lot of ventures out there that they're doing a wonderful job in creating value, but a terrible job in being able to monetize the value themselves. I mean, the whole newspaper industry is struggling with this whole issue themselves. That is providing free content online, and so it's creating value for a lot of people, but how do you monetize that? And what's happening is, the moment they put a paywall in, the numbers just dramatically fall off. Another risk is, we'll talk about, is management team risk. On that, some of these are fairly familiar risks when we look at ventures, but the way I think it's structured is a bit different. If it's a discovery risk, is in fact something there to be discovered. I mean, like if we're doing in life sciences and we want something to sort of solve a problem in terms of whether it's AIDS, whether it's heart attack, something like that, does your preferred solution work? And most of the time, by the time you go through all the trials, 5% of them do, and 95% of them don't. That's a pretty high risk, especially when you look at the time frames. Financial liquidity risk is a very important one in terms of, can you put in place financing instruments so that you can get over the hump between when you are investing the money to when the revenues come in, or if you have to go through a growth phase, how can you capture, how can you, if you like, support that growth phase with your own money or somebody else's. Government regulatory risk is a really critical one, and I'll explain what the government gives, the government takes sometimes, and that can be devastating to ventures. We're seeing some of that going on in Europe at the moment. There's a lot of solar ventures in Europe that were set up on the assumption that the government is going to continue to subsidize the solar industry, and they are somewhat, but if you're running the deficits that most countries are running these days, the subsidies start to be a little bit thin, or thinner than they were at the start of the venture. And the last one is just a risk scaling execution risk. And so, just in terms of what I'll do is, because it's a classroom, I can sort of put up something like this. This is what professors do. So I've got here what are the 9 different categories on that, and these are the types of risks that you can face. And what I'll be expositing as you go through each of these ones here, based on all the companies we dealt with, how they sort of differ in terms of the mix of these risks. Because I think fundamentally you want entrepreneurs, when they go into a sort of a new venture, to understand what it is, the opportunities and risk, because they're far from constant across the venture. So let's take the first one. And this is what I've called creating, building, and riding the wave companies. So this is something where it's a really big thing. And one of the characteristics, if you create and build a wave, is that it's not just you on that wave, you're creating other companies that come together, and there's this whole ecosystem that you are promoting out there. Now, what I call is the 3 phases. So there's the creating the wave phase, where you just roll up and you try to work out, can you get in there and sort of build a bit of momentum out there? And one of the biggest challenges here is the wave even going to form? Because there are a lot of people who say, this is the next big thing. You hear that all the time, isn't it? And I mean, I see so many presentations by people, what is it like? And they say, this is really big and monumental. You know, and even they're hyping it, but that's the word that gets used time and time again. And it turns out to a lot of times not even small. It's pretty non-existent. It's like a ripple rather than a wave on this. And then you get the building of the wave itself. And the example we use in the report to illustrate this was Microsoft. So Microsoft were able to get comments from Gates and a few other people in terms of the startup of the company, which is effectively 1975 to 1990. So a lot of what we're looking at is the first 10 years to 15 years of a company. Most of them are in the period 2000 to 2010. We wanted to roll out with a few classics. And Gates is a very strong supporter of the World Economic Forum, so he was happy to sort of participate in this. And he's by far the best example of creating, building, and riding the wave. So this is a quotation from Gates, where he's saying that basically what they did is that Microsoft created a platform that was essential for making the software and PC high volume industry. So prior to Microsoft, a lot of people had a lot of skepticism about whether it even made sense to have personal computers in the house. And there are all these classic statements by the head of DEC and stuff like that. It doesn't make any sense to think that you'd want to have a computer in the house, because he was selling large mainframes, and that was his business. Okay? And Microsoft saw the world very differently. But you mean from 1975 to about 1980, it wasn't huge. I mean, he was starting to build the wave, and other companies were coming along with it too. And then from the period from about 1980 to 1990 was when they really started to build up momentum. And the interesting thing is, he said that we worked with a lot of other software companies and helped them get off the ground. So not only is Microsoft getting off the ground, it's this swelling of all the other companies that's getting off the ground that makes a wave company. So this is the first. We can only get data on Microsoft. This actually goes up to 1990. They went public about 84, 85. And much as I tried to get the early revenue numbers before they went public, they said they couldn't find them. I'm sure they exist out there in that organization. But I said, well, where's the Microsoft historian? And I said, well, we actually don't have a person called the Microsoft historian. This is, I mean, a fairly consistent growth path. What's fascinating about this is that their relationship with IBM was very central to getting off the ground of this company. But after a while, they had this very rocky relationship with Microsoft. And to hear some of the executives talk about, one of them was talking about how we knew we wanted to get divorced from Microsoft, but not too soon. We had to do this in a divorce in a slow, gradual way. And I mean, I've got quotations in the book there on the Microsoft from several of the key executives, including the first person on the board who was the outside funder. And he was talking about the challenges that they had of that. And actually, one of the interesting things in the interview is he said that he approached Gates to get funding. And Gates said, well, why the hell do we need funding? He said, we're cash flow positive. And Gates' first dark moment he described was his first major customer stiffed him. So he was selling to this company, and the company got acquired by somebody else and then refused to pay anything to Microsoft afterwards. And Gates had a policy after that, he would never live with anything less in the bank than 1 year's expenditures. And so my friend, Dave Marquardt, went up to try and get venture capital into Microsoft, and Gates' initial reaction, we don't need you, we're cash flow positive. He was able to do it, and he's been on the board for 30 years. And he gave us, the quotations from him are very good in Microsoft. But the important thing is that what happened here is that Microsoft started the wave and then helped build the wave, and then it's ridden the wave. Okay, so if you take over a 30-year period, it continues to get this ever larger set of companies around it that are fueling and growing the revenues of the whole system. Now, not to say that it's not going to flatten out, and in fact, you know, it's very hard to think of any company that created as large a number of companies as Microsoft, and obviously they're going to be attacked from other companies in this space. But that's what I mean by a really rich building the wave companies. You'll sometimes see some of these companies in the life sciences, like Genentech, with the recombinant DNA and things like that, where the game is really, if you do this major breakthrough we're not talking about one company being successful, we're talking about 20, 30, 40 companies sort of riding this phenomenon here. Now, the difficulty in the early days is actually in the riding the wave companies is the size of the market. This is one of the big issues that you go on here, is that you don't even know whether the wave's going to fall. And sometimes what happens is that you build a wave and then it just collapses like that. And so some of the dot-com business models in the 98-2000 period were very much, there was this internet wave period. And if you looked at the actual revenue growth rates of some of these companies, they were phenomenal. I've just published a study where I've looked at the revenue growth rates of a whole lot of internet private companies with some other companies at that time. And my argument is in the period 97 to 2000, there was actually a lot of justification in terms of revenue momentum for some of the valuations of those companies. What we didn't expect is how quickly they fell off the cliff. They just went like this and just collapsed and never came back. I mean, I had a student, he had a company called All Advantage, and Fortune wrote up as the dumbest business model ever. Okay, luckily I wasn't mentioned in the article. but you know, and he was actually paying people to watch the web. Okay, so his business model was getting sponsorship and advertising, and he would pay them a certain amount. What he underestimated was ability of computer programs to program the computer so it looked like you were watching, but you really weren't. So we'd have it come on and adjust every 15 minutes or something like that. And so he went through $90 million of funding. And we've never seen of that company or heard of that company since. And so actually there was a little bit of a wave forming for those type of ventures, and it went away. Whereas, I mean, the really great wave companies, I mean, I would argue that Google, I mean, with the Google apps and stuff like that, Google is really, to the extent it's like a 1998, 97 company, it's about 98, 99. I mean, that's pretty much a building a wave type company. It's really building, growing, and riding the wave on that. Now, often what happens sometimes is that a company will help build the wave and then fall off the wave. MySpace is an example of that, isn't it? If you looked at, now MySpace is by any means not the early category position here. If you do the social networking stuff, you can sort of go back to about 1995. And there's always these endless debates on who's first on this. And from a commercial angle, it really doesn't matter, but for egos, it does, obviously. And so you have things, you mean Friendster, and these companies are coming along, and about 2002, MySpace takes up the sort of running on this, and MySpace goes up to about 90 million. And then 2005, 2006, we have Facebook goes up like this, and MySpace goes down like that. So MySpace actually was very, very important in that social networking environment, but they just couldn't hang around. I mean, they literally fell off the wave, and it is a big wave on that. And Facebook is, I think, is the most recent example of a building and riding the wave company without creating the wave company on that. So that's one category of companies that we're seeing. And so a lot of times I'll see business plans come in front of me, and they are what I call riding the wave companies. Nothing wrong with that, but the question is that wave going to continue? And the other thing is, can you create a position in that wave where you can value capture? So, I mean, one of the biggest challenges in Facebook is, in fact, can you monetize the eyeballs on Facebook? And they are doing a better job, but some of the apps that people are putting on Facebook, there's minimal revenues coming from that, even though there's large users. Yeah, did you want to?
Going back to Microsoft, you talked about them being a company that created the wave.
Yeah.
While they were actually in that phase of creating the wave, did they know it?
Well, that's the answer is typically not. That there's this rolling expectations. Now, Gates personally maintains he saw the potential of computers on the desk. And in fact, if you looked at the early statements that were going on in 96, 97, 98, with Gates and Allen, it's almost like he has a much better sense of the transformation that's going to occur than people. And that's part of the reason when he was expositing that there was such entrenched criticism from the establishment, which were the mainframe, that sort of led him to sort of go out on a limb and saying, you may exist, but you're not going to be the only one exist mainframe. I am going to change the way the world's operating. So you do see early statements by Gates that are almost close to, I have a sense of where this is going. But he would be the first to admit, had no idea how quickly it was going to roll. And part of the challenge in these companies is if you start to build the wave, how do you sort of keep the momentum going in with the company so you've got the infrastructure in place to keep on the wave? I mean, eBay is a classic example of no matter how many projections they made of their growth rates, their actual listed items on the web were larger than that. So what the result is, they were always running into capacity with servers and things like that. And eBay's, I think it's sort of like a new category, new product as opposed to a wave, although there's a lot of ventures formed around eBay in terms of private investing that it's much more got an element of a wave thing to it. So that would be an example of the wave categories we talk about and how their opportunities differ. The second and third categories are what we call, it's a brand new category, and it's there are two things going on here in terms of there's a category and a product, and a new category. If you've got an old category and a new category, and then you've got here a new category and an old product, then if it's a new category and new product, this may be something that people really haven't thought about too much. On that, you're bringing it out, and you don't think it's a wave, but it's like reinventing something totally way in which you're approaching things. So it could be like handhelds on that. In the early days of handhelds, people were a little bit skeptical. And was it a phone? No, it's much larger than a phone. And what you could do on that handheld has really exploded, isn't it? And I would argue that the handheld devices now, as with the tablets and stuff like that, are really a whole new category in the way that the people are doing business on that. So if it's a new category, there was a lot of skepticism, again, very much like a wave, of how quickly this new category was going to evolve, if it was going to evolve at all. If it's a new product in a new category, then that's even more challenging. You can't really have an old product in a new category. That's an old product in a new category doesn't exist. What a lot of companies do is that they have an old category and they have an existing product. So an existing category, existing product. So if I'm selling bread, if I'm selling milk and those type of things, that's the nature of the beast. And we know what the product is. We know what the growth rates are probably going to be in that industry. If somebody comes along and said, I've got a different way of packaging milk, great, maybe it'll sell or something like that. But it's a fundamentally different sell than if you're in this category of, you've got to explain to people what the product is and what it does. And so Geoffrey Moore, who's sort of a well-known person in the technology space, talks about crossing the chasm. And his philosophy is really built on a technology. Most of Geoffrey Moore's work is based on new category products. And that is, how can you get new adopters, early adopters for something that you really don't know if it's a great new product? It's a product, and it's new, but you don't know whether it's great. And so he has this notion of the early adopters will be the aficionados and those type of things. And how do you get to the mainstream? Well, a lot of people don't get to the mainstream. They sort of get a very small niche product and it stays that way. What you're really trying to do is transform yourself into a new category and create that in a larger sense. Yeah?
think there are examples of old products feeding into new categories. I don't know how significant they are. Take lithium-ion batteries. They've been in laptops for years. Now they're going into electric cars.
Yeah, I mean, this is what, if you're in an old product, in an old category, the way at which you seek growth is to seek innovative new applications of that product in growth areas.
So that's a new category. Electric cars are a new category.
Well, and this, I don't want to get into a definition, but I mean, I would say that they're moving, the market itself they're moving into is almost a new category, and they're going to play a role in that category with an existing product, aren't they? It's a new growth market, but it's an existing category that has been reformed to take the growth span in that area. So what you often find is is it an existing category or is it a new category? That what you'll find is that there's a spectrum here, and there's certain things that are clearly pretty much new, which what some of the handholds are, and there's something that, I mean, your basic commodities like clothes, food, steel, those type of things. But then you have stuff where you sort of have a lot of innovations in terms of the steels and the different types of lightweight new metals and stuff like that. You're sort of pushing across that line there. The important thing is that you know sort of where a little bit, if you're approaching a venture, where on that spectrum you are. Because if in fact you're going into a new category, you have to educate the market about what that new category is. If you are not going into a new category, the market's probably pretty well educated, and your job is to differentiate yourself from the other players in that market. That's a different challenge, and that's why the distinction is being made here. Now, here is an example of a new product, a new category. This is out of Japan, and again, this is in the study, this case, where they introduced mobile broadband data services in Japan. Okay, it didn't exist at the time they did it. They were leveraging off some existing technologies, but they were one of the first players to do that. And then very soon, some of the major players could come in and sort of knock them around. But, I mean, getting market share in an early position like that was very important. It's interesting, new product in an existing category. This is one, who's used Net-a-Porter here? You use the male or the female one?
The male, obviously.
No, you're doing it for gifts?
The male.
Okay, so Net-a-Porter is a venture that Natalie Massenet set up in the UK in '98, and she had a background in magazines and fashion. And so she decided that she would put on the web magazine formats, and you could just go in there, click through, and buy high-end product. And so this is nothing other than high-end retail delivered on the web in a magazine format. Okay? And I mean, is it a new category? Well, online web sales have been around for a while. It's a little bit of a differentiation as opposed to a new product. But she differentiated herself in such a clever way that she had terrific growth rates. This is, I've got Massenet's. So they're the two examples. Massenet's venture here, LVM, the French company, took a sizable equity in that in about 2004, and she just sold it, the rest of it to them for about 300 million, I think. But she's a classic example of an entrepreneur who initially people said, well, you wouldn't have the ability to get the high-end designers to put their first year productions on the web. That the way in which a lot of people bought high-end fashions was to go into the high-end fashion stores in London and New York and stuff like that. Well, she had a lot of background through the magazines and dealing with these people and a magical selling ability. And so the selling ability was to the people who had the product to put on the web. It wasn't to the endpoint customers initially. It was to the designers and saying, you are not going to downgrade your brand and your design by putting them on Net-a-Porter. In fact, we are going to promote it as high-end as you can find, expensive. When you look at the wrapping and the delivery, you're going to find that this is everything you would expect at a high-end store. Okay, so that's an example of somebody who differentiated themselves with a pretty well-known product and a pretty well-known distribution channel. And so the strategy that you have to do if you're something like an existing category in a new product is that you really sort of got to do a fair amount of value creation and value capture. Is sort of like what, so Massonet is doing a pretty good job here in terms of that. There was no real doubt if she could pull off those designers putting their clothes on the web, that there would be a demand for it. I think the challenge was, were people who are used to viewing the web as sort of like the Walmarts of the world and that sort of stuff, say, no, we're not going to do this. And I think that was the magic that she was able to do. I mean, there was never any discovery technical feasibility risk. You know, the web is well designed to do what she was doing. She could do upscale packaging. She could have FedEx delivered. So the building blocks were pretty much there. It's the question was, could she put the pieces of the puzzle together? So, and this is a pretty much standalone venture. That is, Net-a-Porter, for all its greatness, is not generated 27 other companies around it in the same way as Microsoft has done. So that's why I say it's not a wave company. It's a very innovative individual company in itself. As I mentioned, the really existing category, existing product is where most large companies, small companies have their revenue bases now. They've got their products. All my Irish companies, the majority of revenues come from an existing category that they're in and existing products. And their challenge is, how can they generate new revenue from those existing products, or how can they seed the next generation of products? So the revenue surges have got to come through some new products or a regeneration of the growth rates of their existing products. And they've got challenges on both of them. I think there's no real issue in this one about so much the size of the market. I think that's not an issue. The value creation is not so much an issue. The real issue on these ones is, what sort of growth rates can you expect from companies at which you will know the market's well defined and the product's well defined and the competitors are well defined? And the answers on that, these companies are running at 4 to 5% growth rates sometimes. If you look at the major food products around the companies around the world, I mean, Heinz, Nestle, and stuff like that, their growth rates are never more than about 10%. I mean, you just can't, unless they do acquisitions, you just can't invent food consumption by people to do that. I mean, like, we can't invent a fourth meal of the day. Much as they'd like to invent a fourth meal of the day, something like that, in terms of thinking of quantum ways to sort of kickstart their revenue. So I think the existing category of existing products, the way I talk about that is that you actually, the challenge is, can you get high growth rates by repurposing your product in a certain other way? But you've got to be aware that there's somebody coming along that's going to disrupt you. I mean, with some innovative activities. And so the established steel companies thought they were in a pretty stable market for a long term, and then some really innovative people in terms of metallurgy and things like that came along and sort of just made their traditional blast furnaces and stuff like that obsolete, too expensive, too much consumption of power, all those sort of things. So the whole way in which they were doing business got undermined because they were asleep at the wheel in terms of threats coming on. And I think that, to me, is the biggest issue you run into in terms of these existing categories. Sometimes there's legal challenges to the products. We see that in the tobacco industry, obviously. And a lot of fortunes were made in terms of the tobacco industry, weren't they? We're seeing that with some other industries coming through now. The fast food industry doesn't quite know how to position themselves here. Pepsi's trying to say we want to be Pepsi, sort of like we want 30% of our revenues to come from what we call good food other than tasty food. And they invent these euphemisms for good food is lower calories, lower sugar content and stuff like that. Unfortunately, the consumption base of consumers is, give me the Big Mac, not give me the little, I mean, when McDonald's puts stuff on the menu and they put a salad in there, the salad says 2%, but the Big Mac says 98% of their revenues. You know, the customer base at the moment is not generating the revenues that they thought they would be for some of the new products that we have. Another category, I'll go through these because I've got a bit of other stuff, is we are redesigning the whole value chain. And we're seeing a whole lot of inventions here. The Indian outsourcing movement was very much of this. Okay, so General Electric had a division in India where they were doing all their financial transactions. The person who was running that got frustrated because he kept on being asked for other companies, can you do our financial transactions for us? And General Electric said no. He convinced General Electric, why don't you spin us out? And that in the study, in the soft copy version, is called Genpact. And that's a company that, when they got out of General Electric, they were going like 10,000 employees, 15,000 employees, 22,000 employees, growing at the rate of 6,000 or 7,000 employees a year. You can just imagine the complexity of managing that sort of growth. But that's that outsourcing market. One of the challenges in the outsourcing market is that you have to differentiate yourself and quickly become not just a low-cost outsourced producer, but a value-added producer. And if you looked at the companies like Infosys, who were one of the key players in the 80s in this outsourcing world, they have morphed themselves very effectively to be much more than a simple outsourcing device. They're into strategy, they're into IT as a technology component of your strategy, etc., as well as providing outsourcing. But they're attempting to differentiate themselves. I'll give you an example of some really innovations in the value chain. One of them is OpenLane, which is one of our MBAs set up. And if you think of the fleet vehicles that some of these corporations have, they resell those vehicles after a while. Well, the mode of which it used to do is that there'd be sort of like a lot at Hayward. You drive all these physical vehicles up there. You would have people bidding on the vehicles. 70% of them wouldn't sell on that day, so they would drive them back to somewhere else. And then they would go through this process again and again. So he said, this is crazy. I mean, why don't we just have an online basis of this stuff and have all the vehicles tagged, have reports on them in terms of what the engine capacity, I mean, how many miles it's done, how many repairs and stuff like that, and then create a market where there's no physical movement of the cars, and there are clearing prices. It clears 24/7 on this sort of stuff, and he's really restructured the whole fleet sale market, and it's a hugely different market, much more efficient and far more lower cost. That's the sort of venture at which you're creating value and lowering cost, isn't it? That's the sort of nirvana that you want in terms of a company, in terms of a business model out there. And I think they're the sort of things that we're seeing in a value business chain strategy that I think is quite different. One of the challenges in the business value chain thing is in the execution scaling here, and that is partnering. So you have to sort of have these other people come into, you're only a small part of the value chain. You're trying to sit above the value chain and aggregate everybody into that value chain and say, come into a world which I control. And there are other people who say, well, what's in it for us? And you say, well, you're going to sell your vehicles a little more effectively, quicker, you may get a better price, or when you take account the holding cost and the transportation cost, it's still a better deal. But it's one of these things that it looks like there's a lot of rents to be created by restructuring the value chain. The really interesting fights in who captures the total rent and how do you distribute that rent across the parts of the value chain. And I think that to me is this execution and scaling and value capture is the sort of the big issue that arises there. And it's a far more complex one than sort of a Natalie Massenet sort of venture. Research discovery ventures, again, these are really different from some of the other product categories that we've looked at there. Life sciences, it turns out that a lot of the really classic European universities have got very good life science professors and scholars and stuff like that. So they have the potential to bring out products on that. What you find though is that the time frame between when they start working on these projects to when revenues start to appear from it can be 15 to 20 years. And one of the challenges, how do you get in there in the middle and accelerate that process, or have funding people in between the discovery and what we think is the fundamental discovery, and then the commercial proof of that, and then the phases. And that's an aspect of these ventures that's totally different than the classic internet or the retail store chains and stuff like that. I mean, if you wanted to think of Net-a-Porter, once she could get those people to give them the clothes, she could whip it together in 6 months. Brutal 6 months, takes a lot of infrastructure, but there was a roadmap that we can do this. Whereas if we're trying to solve something in terms of AIDS or something like that, there's this overhanging. Do we have anything here? Is anything going to get approved out there? And I've seen friends who go through phase 2, 6 years or 7 years of their life, and they get dinged on phase 3. And you're sitting there, and you're just sitting there, and it's like feeling like the world's collapsed. I mean, I thought when I'm in the other side of my life in the sports management, I've sat in dressing rooms with the losing side of grand finals and championships, and it's a pretty dull scene. Nobody knows what to say. I mean, our Stanford women lost the Final Four, and I was just, one of my students was one of the players on the court there, and we were just emailing each other today, and she was talking about the locker room. And I felt like, Mel, it's not the end of the world. I mean, I've got friends who on 7 years put their life into recombinant DNA and stuff like that, and they fail trial 3. And they have to go back and start up again. I mean, that's the sort of real serious problems for them to sort of face. A fascinating one in the study here is in the mining industry in Fortescue. So Fortescue Metals is the Australian mining company. And it's sort of interesting. Andrew Forrest is obviously quite a colourful figure in Australia. He had the background in terms of 1 or 2 other mining ventures that after a while actually did very well. It's just the initial round of investors did not as well as they hoped for. But he got into this area about 93. And I'll show you what here. This is Forrest. I'll come back to the quote. But Forrest is looking, he discovers some iron ore there in about 2003. And he wants to get the right, but it's inland northwest Australia. And BHP and Rio will not allow him to use their railroad. Okay, for some strange reason. Okay? So, and he gets a quote and he says, well, actually to build a railroad and build a port's $2 billion. Okay, that's an obstacle, but we'll do it. So he raises the money in terms of that, and sort of builds the railroad, builds the port, goes through endless litigation in terms of this all along the way, and then finally, after this long period, the first full year of revenues is over $1 billion. I mean, now that's a totally different company than what you normally think about entrepreneurship, isn't it? Now, obviously, in this one, I have a vested interest of showing one of the best entrepreneurs in the world comes from Northwest Australia. But I mean, I'm serious. I mean, I fundamentally think he's got every attribute that you would want a wonderful entrepreneur. It's a great story. The incumbents fought him to the tooth and nail. He overcame that, and then he rolls out $1 billion in the revenue. And when I tell the people, other people around the world about this story, they say you've got the zeros missing. Well, there shouldn't be that many zeros in terms of the revenue stream. And I said, well, this is the mining industry. Actually, this is what this industry is about, and some other industries are totally different. And one of the objects of this study was to show how entrepreneurship is not a singular thing. It's actually a very diverse set of things. So I was sort of really proud when I went to WA and I was able to sort of get Forrest to. That was not easy. Actually, I had a friend of mine has been an advisor, and he's chairman of the West Coast Eagles, and he's sort of really deep into and he runs a firm that is the major mining consulting company in WA, and he sort of did the legwork in terms of Forrest saying, okay, is this guy for real? Yes, he is. This is a good thing to do. And even then, we had to get the quotations really gone through by legal people, because unfortunately Forrest is being sued by the Securities Commission there. And so every single word was sort of checked and a lot of things on that. So this one here, I mean, the biggest risk here is suppose that he couldn't build the railroad. You know, he just ran out of money. That's exactly what BHP and Rio wanted to happen. Because then they would have gone in and said, oh, we can magically find room on our railroad if you would sell us the whole rights to the iron ore. Okay? Did you know we could actually run trains with 12 carriages rather than 10? Okay? Yeah, wow, never thought of that. Okay? And so the object, I think, of the incumbents there was to sort of starving for cash and get the valuable asset, which was a stranded asset. That's what we call it, a stranded asset, because it was under the ground, hard to get to, and you had to sort of build the infrastructure to capture the asset. And again, totally different environment than what we're seeing here. Another one is what we call roll-ups. Now, roll-ups are very common in terms of entrepreneurship. A lot of people actually don't call roll-ups entrepreneurship. I mean, in terms of building an asset and growing an asset, I think roll-ups are just as legitimately a form of entrepreneurship as any of the others. I mean, you're taking a small asset and growing it large. Now, it just happens that some of the stuff is well known in their existing products, existing categories, but the challenges of successfully doing the roll-up are immense. And along the way, there's a lot of fall-offs. The classic one we studied in the project was WPP, which is, that's Sir Martin Sorrell's company, it started off in the UK, wireless products. So in 1985, Sorrell was working for Saatchi & Saatchi. And Saatchi & Saatchi in that stage was Maurice and Charles, and he was called the third Saatchi. Only the other two Saatchis didn't view him as the third. They viewed him as maybe 1/7 of them, and that did not go over well. And so Sorrell is a very determined, very committed person, and he said, okay, I'm going to take over this shell company, and that Wireless Products was a shell company from the north of England that he took over. That's where WPP comes from. And then he went on this acquisition roll-up where he took out one company that was 13 times the size of his company. Okay? Now, one of the challenges if you do a roll-up is here. The two main challenges are financial and execution. Integration risk is a big issue when you're doing all these things. But I mean, if you're using debt to some of these things, this is Sorrell. I'll come back to his quote, but this one here is the operating income to revenues, and you can see in the 91, 92, 93 period, they ran into some problems. Now, if you calculate the debt to equity of this company, the equity is negative. Okay, so it was a little hard to compute. What I did is I actually did a ratio of total liabilities to total assets. Okay, because when equity is negative, the liabilities are greater than the assets, and I thought that was one way of presenting it. But in this graph I've got here, I'm just showing they overextended themselves financially with debt. They had some instruments that he said that he misunderstood, some convertible debts. He said, although he's an accounting person by background, but he actually in the interview said, I misunderstood what that financial asset was. On that, he's very frank in terms of this. Now, it helps to have gone to be now almost the leading marketing company in the world, but he looks back at this and said, I probably, in terms of this phase, way overextended myself. But they've got some wonderful quotations in there from Sorrell where he said, even in the dark days, I never had any doubt we'd survive. He said, other people did. The London press was writing us up as we were gone. These people here were just taking out Ogilvy and some other people that were mega their own size, and there were some massive personality differences. One of the funniest quotations is that he takes over Ogilvy, and Ogilvy's like about 6'4", 6'6" imperious. Martin Sorrell is about 5'7", 5'8", and he said the idea of that odious little turd taking over my company frightens me every single minute of the day. Okay, and you can sort of just see the way, and I've seen Ogilvy talk, just the dismissive arrogance of him doing that, and Sorrell saying, "Yap all you might. I mean, just let me integrate this company, and I'll show you what it's all about." And so now it's an amazing story, WPP, but it was an aggregation. It was a roll-up. A lot of the roll-ups don't do so well. Well, this is actually a great quote from Sorrell. He said, if you start at the old age of 40, and there's only 2 people in the room, and the object in your lifetime is to build a major advertising and marketing services companies, you have to do it primarily by acquisition, otherwise you'd be dead before you got very far. Okay, so he said this was an imperative. Given he had the dream, it was an imperative to sort of do the acquisition binge on that. And he still does probably 20 or 30 acquisitions, but now he's got the integration capability. One of the largest Irish companies in the world, CRH, has done something like 700 acquisitions of building materials companies around the world. Really successful, very highly profitable. Now the margins in that industry are relatively low, but the scaling up is just phenomenal. One of the worst ones is Heilman Brewing Company. So Heilman Brewing Company was a brewing company here, and they kept on acquiring other brands, except that what happened is that the brands that they acquired, if you plotted the brand percentage of the market share, every brand that they acquired was going that way. And so it was like all these people getting together with a bad cough for a bout of ammonia. I mean, it really was. I mean, this one I know backwards because Bond acquired Heilman, and he acquired it for 1.1 billion, sold off the bakery, and for 100 million, and he was left with an acquisition of a whole set of decrepit breweries for $1 billion. And then he got charged in Western Australia with assets, and I was the valuation person. For Heilman, I was flown around the US on this private jet, visiting brewery after brewery, in terms of, I mean, he had like tons of breweries in terms of different ones here. And you could sort of see it was a strategy gone right. I mean, he never got one single brand that was great in terms of moving north. It was always moving south. On that. So that actually was a classic example of by the time Bond got to it, and he was trying to do a more of a roll-up, because at that stage he had Castlemaine Tuies in Australia. He had a brewery in elsewhere, and so he thought he was going to be the brewer of the world. Very similar to what John Elliott did, only everything went south on it. Because that's a common thing with roll-ups, is that you overuse debt. You run into a financial crisis, and you have to sort of sell these things at the wrong cycle of the market on that. Just in terms of, I won't keep on, well, the last 2, government regulatory change. I'll go for about another 15 minutes, and then government regulatory change. This is where you get, the government changes the regulations. Telecommunications is a very common example of this. We see plenty of companies set up. The trouble with regulatory change ventures is that the government can change the rules of the game. So this is Suntec Power in China. This is interesting things. This is their Spanish revenues. So the Spanish revenues in 2008 was 719 million. In 2009 was 61 million. Okay? Because the government changed the rules of the game in terms of incentive systems. They were running out of money, the Spanish government. At least they've been running out of money for quite some time, but they sort of woke up and said well, the situation may be a little bit more dire than we thought, and so that's a classic problem with these regulatory ventures on that. But basically a lot of wealth has been created by regulatory change, because typically the incumbents are slow at the wheel. And sort of the really startup ventures can be fleet of foot on that. The last one, just in terms of the idea transplant, this is where you take a great idea from one country and move it to another. And so like we saw in the late 90s, Kerry Packer did eCore in Australia. And the idea was to take proven business models from here and use them in Australia. So we had eBay was a joint venture between, eBay Australia was a joint venture between eCore and eBay here. Monster did the same thing. We're seeing that time and time again. The really good ones that actually understand, you just don't transplant the idea, you adapt it to the environment that you're playing with. There's all disputes going on. Baidu is one of the companies out of China in the study, and Baidu always gets the criticism, they're the Chinese Google. There's a criticism because it's sort of an implied slap to them of, you just copycatted that. Well, actually, it turns out that Baidu, Robin Lee, was doing software and doing technology in terms of search engines in 95, 96. He went to the US in the early 90s. He has some patents in 95, 96. He went back to China to sort of do the search engines. What he did do is that he observed the paid business model of GoTo. And GoTo was the model in which Google applied. So the paid business model actually came from GoTo. And Robin Lee, in his quotations, is very precise. He said, what I did is I saw the GoTo business model and I applied it in China. Because he wants to be able to say he's not the copycat. Now, he's benefited by Chinese regulations, but this is the sort of nuances that you run into in studies like this. Now, just some comments in terms of the sector itself. We did a very extensive stuff of understanding this sector. This is, we took growth rates of companies all around the world. You know how they publish the fastest growing companies list in country after country, whether it's the Inc. Top 500, Deloitte does these lists. And what's fascinating, we've got the most extensive collection of these examined. This is, in black, the number of times a company stays on the list once. Okay? So you're listed on this list, you'll see the Business Review Weekly does this in Australia. Inc. does this. There are lists that the Sunday Financial Times do this. And my expression is, being listed on a fast company list is a prediction of a very short-run fast company. Okay? Literally. It's damning evidence that the average statistic is about 60% of the times you're on the list and the list only once. Okay? It's very hard to have consistent high growth rates over time. This is getting to understand the challenges of this sector. This is another sort of example of the sector as we looked at the jobs created and the jobs lost in the sector in 10 different countries. This is in sections 3 and sections 4 of the report. The green is the gross jobs created between years 4 and 5 of a company. So we aged the companies when they were started, and we looked at from year 4 to 5 how many jobs were created, how many revenues are created. We rank them from top to bottom, and then we call the one at which the jobs are created, the total jobs created in the economy, we call that 100%. And then we say, okay, well, for every job created, how many jobs are simultaneously lost? Most politicians are telling the story is it's all about job creation, job creation, job creation. Isn't that the story they tell? This is the most wonderful sector for job creation. Partially true. It's one of the most horrific sectors for job destruction. I'm serious. Of every 100 jobs in this sector created, simultaneously, 70% are lost. People have never actually fell across that statistic before. It's a sector in which there's tremendous fluidity going on, and what this means is that you've got to build an infrastructure so that you know how to handle the down years. Yeah?
How are you measuring that simultaneous job destruction?
Well, we basically what we do is that we have, let's suppose we do it for the UK. We have all the companies in our sample for UK, and we know their year of incorporation. We look at their headcount in year 4, their headcount in year 5, the revenue in headcount and revenue in year 5. So suppose we have 10,000 companies, and like Spain we've got 80,000. we take the highest to the lowest. So these will be the ones who have the largest increase in jobs. These will have the largest decrease in jobs, right? And then we say, okay, and I'll show you the way to do this. It's this way. We call this the mountain of job creation and the valley of job destruction, okay? You've got to have jazzy terms. Okay? So we add the first company and the second company. So we take, this is the highest number of jobs created by company one. We take the second highest company and we keep adding the jobs up. And where the curve flattens out is when you run into no jobs are being created in a rate. And then you keep on going and it drops down. If there are net jobs created, it will sit above the line here. If there are net jobs lost, it will go down below the line. Okay? Nobody's actually done these charts before. It's actually, I think it's nice in terms of just highlighting. And what you're interested in is actually, is the destruction coming like this? So 1% of the companies are losing a lot of the jobs and 1% of the companies are creating the jobs? Or is it sort of like that? And the pattern is much more like this than that. Yeah?
Is it normalized for that particular industry that the company's saying, or is it all jobs, all companies in that economy, and that's you capturing a macroeconomic trend?
We've done it twice, two ways. One is by industry, one is by country. And you get the same patterns. And the other thing is that we're not examining this all at one calendar year. So we actually take it from 98 to 205 because we want to go years 4 to 5. And so 205, we'll take the data up to 2010 to get years 4 to 5. So we have 98 to companies, and so years 4 to 5 will be 202, 203, and then we'll have a series of companies in 203, 04, series of companies of 04, 05. So we've actually diversified about 6 different time periods to get you away from, is this just a sort of a time period phenomenon on that. But this is the first exercise that shows just how much detail the sector has got in terms of negative. Now, the fundamental question is, where are these jobs and the revenues going? You know, part of it is the incumbents are coming back in. In the early days, you create a new industry, you take some stuff away from the incumbents, and the incumbents repackage themselves and start going in, and they've got industrial strength. You know, they've got the big guns, don't they? Another thing that's going on is some of these companies don't know how to scale. So there's a lot of self-inflicted wounds going on here. So they think that they can sort of take a company from 20 to 50, 50 to 100, but they don't have the management systems in place. Some of them are engineers and they have little respect for financial planning systems. I'm serious. I mean, I've gone through a lot of interviews and I've done a lot of work on this in terms of the engineers are wonderful in one set of management systems, but in terms of budgeting and stuff like that, that's not the world that they live in. And so in terms of saying, well, what happens if we grow at this rate? What do we need in terms of working capital and that? And they overextend themselves. And then somebody comes along and sort of takes them out on that. So this is a sector in which there's just a lot more challenging than people think. Just to illustrate that is, what we did is we looked at the growth rates of companies, and these are about 360,000 observations here over 10 countries. We looked at the growth rates in years 2 to 3, 3 to 4, and 4 to 5. A plus means a company has had 3 years of successive growth rates. And while in revenues, it is the case that 31% of the companies did have growth rates that were 3 years positive, the vast majority didn't. And this is why we call this the ladders and snakes growth path. Most companies, when they're growing, will go like this. Bump, bump, bump. Bump, 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 bump. Like that. It's the exception that goes like that. And it's really how you handle these things that are often the distinguishing characteristics of the great company builders. And again, this is one of the few studies that has highlighted that this sector is quite different from some of the other sectors in terms of the shifts that go on quite substantially and the fragility of some of the companies. Anybody who's been on investment, I mean, venture investment firms or in venture capital, you sort of get this, don't you, Larry?
Sure.
You see this, but the people who talk about this don't think of it this way. They think, oh, venture capital or early stage company, that's where we want to put some money in, but it's typically not well-directed money, if they put any money in. But the sad thing about, like in the US, a lot of the TARP money that they went into, very little of it ended up in the early stage company sector. But how can we save the Citibanks and all these sort of companies that in the last 10 years have destroyed hundreds of thousands of jobs, okay? Never mind the fact that we've got this other sector out that are now has created jobs and created revenues. They don't have the lobbying power in Congress to get hold of the TARP money. And then phase two, what happens is basically they say, the people in the current administration say, well, actually, we sort of knew exactly what we were doing. We didn't think in 2008, 2009, that sector was ready for an infusion of capital. Now that somebody's pointed out it's all part of our grand plan that it is now ready for an infusion. The trouble is that throwing money at it's not the issue. The issue is educating the people to use it wisely and having a group of entrepreneurs who understand this part of that. Now, the back end, I'll just highlight, I've only got about 5 or 6 slides to go. Part of the questions we asked people were, what were the growth accelerators, what were the growth challenges, and what were the dark moments that they faced? And so this is where we've got 70 of these detailed case studies. And if you look at the last 180 pages, you'll see interview after interview of these structured questions. And I've gone through and coded the responses into, say, what were the growth accelerators? And the market opportunity is the largest growth accelerator. So positioning yourself to be in the right market is consistently the first or second. Now, because I've got 70 companies here, I broke it up into Americas, North and South, Europe, Middle East and Africa, and Asia Pacific. And what you'll find actually is that there is far more commonality across the countries in the regions than people would think. That is that even though venture capital is quite different in its degrees of sophistication, the challenges and the growth accelerators facing companies have a lot in common across the continents. Now, anybody who's dealt at what I call the coalface of these companies would sort of say that's probably the case. But again, nobody's really looked at that and documented it. And what we're trying to say is that to an entrepreneur in India, or an entrepreneur in Vietnam or Indonesia, these findings actually can be applied to you. That just because you're in Indonesia doesn't mean to say the need to address a large market is not important in terms of growing the business. Okay? And we've got rankings of the accelerators there. Now, the growth challenges, this was the most interesting one, because you can see the ranking there is 19%, this is the Americans. Number 1 is 19%, number 2 is 17%, number 2A is 70%, the next. Have a look at the growth challenges. HR, people issues, are the dominant problem across every single country, every single region. And it's not even close, it's between, I mean, if you wanted to think of horse racing team, write your own ticket on number 2, okay? If you wanted to think of those sort of terminologies, okay? And, I mean, it's immense. The problems that, that question has got a lot of richness in terms of, you've got 70 answers in the study of people, and a lot of them people are talking about the growth aspirations. So part of the problem with the people issue is maybe the people aren't ambitious enough. I mean, the people problems arise in different directions. I mean, in New Zealand, so an interesting question, they call in New Zealand the 3 Bs. I mean, a boat, a BMW, and a beach house, okay? Once you've got all those 3, why bust your gut? Okay, you've made it. Well, that's great for the individual sitting there in the Bay of Islands looking out over, and he's made it, you know, drives up from Auckland in his BMW and he's got his boat and his beach house. Terrific. Does nothing for for the New Zealand economy in terms of the growth engine of companies. So this false aspiration, or this ceiling aspiration level, is a huge problem in some countries. Other ones, people talk about HR issues in terms of hiring people and creating a culture which you keep on hiring AAA people. I mean, some of the Indian companies that did very well actually did a very severe recruiting strategy where they said, okay, we want AAA people from the start and we want to maintain AAA people. Now, if you are growing at the rate of 60% every 3 months, it's very hard to maintain that consistency of AAA hiring. And just as important, when you hire that many, how many people do you think are not going to fit? There will be some, won't there? Most people do not do a good job, especially when they're high-growth startups, of actually cutting out the people or re-educating the people so that they're less of a problem. Entrepreneurs just have to be optimistic, or else they get killed. I mean, there are so many tough times. If you look at the snakes and ladders growth path, I mean, how many, if you're not an optimist and you start to see 2 successive negatives in a row, you got to be able to sort of say, well, you know, there's a problem out there, but there's not a death-defying problem. There's just a challenge out there. I mean, that's this, when you see all this job losses going on there, and you're starting to sort of see a competitor come in, you've got to sort of resurface and you've got to restructure yourself. And I think the fascinating thing was to find out how these sort of attributes permeate, you know, whether we looked at entrepreneurs in Arabia, Argentina, Mexico, China, India, and stuff like that. It's sort of like a common set of notions on that. And I think that's sort of one of the big takeaways from the study is that this is not a profession for everyone. And this is a very tough thing. And if you don't want to play, if you're not got those attributes, then probably working for a large corporation may be a better option for you. Okay, so that's basically, it's a fairly broad-ranging study, but I think it does have quite a bit in terms of diversity.